Okay, we're going to be doing a little look at the Inquisition today for reasons that may or may not become apparent later. Hopefully, we're sharing a screen here. Oh, about yes, there it goes on the Inquisition. This I'm not saying is the end all be all article on the Inquisition. It's certainly as biased as any other, and you can, if you want to do the research, collect them all and make your own comparison of who's telling the most truth. And that's what any good research is you have to get people on both sides of an issue, and that way same thing with Bible translations. You get a bunch of different viewpoints with different biases, and between each one trying to overcome the biases of the other, you usually get pretty close to the truth. So anyway, I wanted to find an article that didn't seem to be leaning one way or the other and didn't have an immature or mocking tone to it, and wasn't, on the other hand, so academic and scholarly that nobody would know what they're talking about, because when you write papers to impress the academic world, you don't write necessarily very clearly. So, and I don't want to spend all day on this either. This is something you could easily spend a great deal of time on, but I don't want to do that. I want to make points. That's what I do. And sometimes in making points, I leave out too much, but I think everybody's familiar enough with the Inquisition, or at least the word, to have some idea what it's about. But that's the problem. Sometimes all we have is some idea, and we don't really know what we're talking about on a subject such as the Bible or anything to do remotely with the Bible. It's mostly what people have an impression about, and that's not always very accurate. So I just wanted to go over this very briefly, just to give an overview of some principles and some hopefully actual history. Here again, it has to go back to how you determine whether something's true or not, and some people brush aside all of history, and that makes the search for any kind of truth rather pointless. So I'm operating from the position of that being truth is discoverable, and so I do take historical records into account, but I just don't get them all from one place. So that's all I'm trying to say about that. So let's look at this article. The link's in the description. There's also a link for something I did on church history that didn't have much to do with details about the Inquisition itself, but some of the targets of the Inquisition. And we're going to go into that in this article. So I don't know if I think a whole lot of Will Durant as a historian, but the Inquisition is something I think everyone would agree was a bad thing. But it wasn't just one thing. That's the issue. There wasn't just one Inquisition. But they talk about all of it in its series of stages as one Inquisition. So if you hear it called the Inquisition, that's what they're really referring to, if they know anything about it at all. So the article will present an overview, which is what I was looking for, an overview. Their focus is on justification, or that is to say excuses, methodologies, victims, and results of the 600-year reign of this most dreaded institution. It was an institution. It was instituted by the Catholic Church. And a brief hello to people in chat. Let me try to go through this, and then I'll look at the chat later, as always. So we have historical foundations, heresy from the Greek word there, an opinion or doctrine not in line with the accepted teaching of the church, the opposite of orthodoxy. And try to pay attention to some of these terms, because I will try to come back to them later on a more modern application of Inquisition as a principle. And that's why I entitled this Inquisitions Then and Now, because yes, that sort of thing goes on. It's just not overt. Satan has learned through the course of time that the best approach is the subtle boiling, frog and boiling water approach. Of direct frontal assault rarely works. And yes, I did pause every now and then to drink some tea. Sorry about that. In late 20th century America, with its extreme separation of church and state, it is hard to imagine that there was a time when heresy was considered not only an ecclesiastical or church-related crime, but a secular one too. This is a rarity in history. America's separation of the two is an anomaly. If you look at it, most societies have blended the two together. During the Middle Ages, church and state were often united in the cause of maintaining social order. During medieval times, often difficult to distinguish between secular and ecclesiastical. And, you've heard, hopefully, some history about kings and popes working together. This is nothing new or surprising. The idea that heresy was both an ecclesiastical as well as a secular crime has a long pedigree. So, as I just said, there's plenty of evidence that church and state were almost always blended together, and they just had different things to emphasize. And then they were really one entity working together, for one purpose, at least two entities, maybe for one purpose. So later, it says the great, and again, I'm just reading this article. Your mileage may vary on another article. Codified the equation of heresy with treason, so that the treason being the secular charge, heresy being the ecclesiastical. It comes from the word ecclesia, which means gathering or assembly or congregation. And that's the word used in the New Testament for what is badly translated church. And so, by equating the two, heresy and treason, you could put someone to death for having wrong ideas. And this is, even atheistic societies have done this. If you have wrong ideas, you're either insane or seditious, and you should be dealt with very harshly so that the rest of the people will learn not to speak up. And so, or even have ideas in their head that are wrong. And this is what Orwell's book, 1984, was all about. It goes on to say, during the Middle Ages, the burning of heretics was not unusual in the 200 years leading up to the Inquisition, which officially started in 1227 to 31 AD. So even then, it wasn't precise to the year, but that range of years, somewhere in there, it started, that being the Middle Ages, when the Inquisition officially started. Often burnings were instigated by secular authorities or by mobs. One of the first known medieval burnings of heretics was by Robert the Pious, King of France in 1022 AD, who ordered unrepentant heretics to the flames. Mob actions in Milan and other places resulted in the death of heretics at the stake when angry mobs pulled unrepentant heretics out of ecclesiastical prisons. So they were already in prison, pulled them out and burned them to death. So the idea of consigning heretics to burning at the stake was well ingrained by the time of the start of the Inquisition. So the Inquisition did not invent these methods of dealing with people who the rest of society deemed a threat in some way, but they certainly put it into a codified practice. In 1184, Pope Lucius III issued a bull, that's what they called it, an edict of sorts, against heretics, which would establish many of the principles of jurisprudence later adopted by the Inquisition. Among those was the idea that anyone who shielded or took care of heretics would be, or sent them aid, would be liable to the same punishment as the heretics, that they should be turned over to the secular arm for punishment, and that relapsed heretics should receive steeper sentences. That is to say, you repented and then you went back to it, including confiscation of property, which, there you go, there's a major motivation. And as we'll see later, the more you had to lose, the more of a target you became. Of interest is the fact that two main targets of the Inquisition of 40 years later were identified by name: Catharists and the Poor of Lyons, or Waldensians. And now, the other link I have in the description is to my video, Little Known Church History, or Little Known Facts of Church History. And it goes into the other side, mostly from the view of the targeted groups. It doesn't say much about the Inquisition itself as it does about the rationale and punishment and persecution of small groups of people who broke off. Now, I'm not defending necessarily the small groups, although many of them were much more pious than the pious ones in the Catholic Church, or even the reformers. They were no better, really. And so that's what that book's about. And it was written from a Calvin. It was sponsored by Calvin College or something like that. But the guy who did the research was very honest and did not paint the Calvinists in a good light, but he just simply reported history. So that's just another perspective on this same issue of inquisitions against people who disagree with the agreed upon by the majority viewpoints on various things and practices. So then we have some quotes every now and then. Here's the actual decree of Pope Lucius against heretics. Just to skip through here a little bit, to abolish the malignity or like slanderous sort of idea of diverse heresies which are lately sprung up. The power committed to the church should be awakened, imperial strength, and crushing the heretics is the key word there. And the truth, what they consider truth. And so for some reason, I can't select any text there. I don't know what the problem is. Anyway, they had this idea that church/state was to punish those that they didn't like. And they declared the Catharists, the Patarines, and the Poor of Lyons, and a whole bunch of other people to a perpetual anathema. Anathema means curse. And you will find, I have a hard copy of the Canon and Decrees of the Council of Trent from a Catholic source that has, I don't know, hundreds of anathemas against what Protestants basically believe. And that, so when you see the word anathema, that's what they mean. It's a curse, and it's called a perpetual curse against all these people by Pope Lucius. And they also added that anyone who defended these heretics were aiding and abetting these heretics, as they called them, were to be punished as well. The same sentence. So basically, let's get down to the end here. Those who, after having abjured their errors or cleared themselves upon examination to their bishop, if they be found have relapsed, we decree without any further hearing, they be forthwith delivered up to secular power and their goods confiscated to the use of the church. So there they go, confiscation of property if you don't agree with the majority in power or the people in power, whether they're an actual majority or not. And many of the ideas in the aforementioned bull were further codified by the largest church council in history, the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. The Council of Rome declared that unrepentant heretics should be excommunicated and turned over to secular authorities for punishment. Punishment was unspecified, but confiscation of property was explicitly allowed. Thus, one of the areas of greatest abuse in the coming Inquisition, the confiscation of property by the church and secular authorities, was officially codified by canon law. The stage was set for the Inquisition. So in other words, they had church and state working together to punish people they didn't like by these official rules being on the books, which allowed them to take property, among other things. This was a very big draw for the Inquisitors and the powers that be in the government and the church to deal with people who defied them, and any excuse would do. You didn't even need good witnesses, as we'll find out as we go along in here. And then now we're going to go to the next section. Let me take a little sip of tea. Theological foundations. And this is kind of interesting. The proponents of the Inquisition, and amazingly apologists since the Inquisition ended in 1834, point to both biblical and theological sources for its justification. The biblical passages most often quoted by the early Inquisitors were from Mosaic law in the Old Testament. This is, of course, somewhat questionable theology, to put it mildly, as Mosaic law regarding, say, dietary restrictions were completely ignored by the church from the 1st century on. Yet suddenly, in the 13th century, Mosaic law seemed to be a perfectly reasonable justification for burning thousands of people at the stake. Key passages are quoted below, edited for brevity. These are basically for the laws of Moses for the nation of Israel to deal with idolaters, that is to say, people who were taking people away from the God who led them out of Egypt, and that there were severe punishments for this, because idolatry is a very bad thing to do against the real God and replace him with a false God. And this was, the pottery calling the potter an idiot, basically. So this was dealt with harshly also because the fact that the Messiah would come from these people and they had to be set apart, and there could be no compromise. You couldn't bend the rules with this sort of thing because God was preparing the way for the Messiah to come and redeem mankind, and there had to be some higher degree of purity than there was for the rest of the world. And that's why the punishments were harsh, but they were never applied to any other group of people for that reason, because it's only through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the 12 tribes that were headed by the 12 sons of Jacob / Israel that would be where the Messiah would come from, and then narrowed down and so forth. But this is what the Inquisitors drew from. And does that sound familiar today? It sounds like, on one hand, lordship salvation, and on the other hand, Hebrew roots, or whatever splinter names or whatever people prefer to call it. They're putting Christians under the laws of Moses. And this is exactly the motivation and pseudo-theology of the Inquisitors. Okay, this is what they used to justify the arm of the state and the use of force and torture and all sorts of other things against people, Christians even, whether Christians or not, but including Christians who defied their rules. You'll notice also that even the Old Testament has no indication of torture of such people. They were simply put to death. Okay, and death is not the worst thing that can happen to a person. The worst thing that can happen is suffering. And so the torture part is completely made up by the Inquisitors or the people before them who were burning people alive at the stake. That's certainly a torturous death, not a humane death. And these are, even then in the Old Testament, you must inquire, probe, and investigate it thoroughly, okay? You can't just flippantly declare someone guilty and have them put to death. You had to do a proper investigation to make sure they were guilty, and you had to have credible witnesses, and at least 2 or 3 of them. And so this is, even when the Inquisitors were taking things from the laws of Moses, which they shouldn't have done in the first place, they were misapplying them and adding to them in ways that the Bible never condoned. So they could not, still can't justify what they do from the Bible. Many of the elements found in the aforementioned extracts from Mosaic law could later be closely emulated by the Inquisition, including purging of prophets and dreamers that led to the death of Joan of Arc, for example. Family members in the Inquisition were encouraged to testify against each other. There's the Orwellian thing. He didn't make that up. Putting to death heretics as an example to others. The guidance to inquire, probe, and investigate towns that have gone astray could be a job description for later Inquisitors, and destruction of whole towns to wipe out heresy. These were the things that they twisted and amended to suit their purposes. But again, the Bible did not condone any use that they were making out of it at all, especially for Christians. So, and again, there was no torture involved. It was much more difficult for the proponents of the Inquisition to find New Testament justification for their acts. The most often quoted New Testament verse is from John 15. If anyone does not remain in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown in the fire, and burned. Like the branch that people discard and then burn. Not that you're supposed to literally burn people. Okay, but that didn't stop them. They twisted it as they twisted the Old Testament. And the Catholic theologians of the time gave their blessing to the methods and justifications, excuses for these things. As the following startling passages from St. Thomas Aquinas' massive theological work, Summa Theologica, show, Aquinas, a Dominican monk, is generally considered to be the greatest Catholic theologian since Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries. Aquinas talks of the extermination of heretics. Quote, wherefore, if forgers of money, all other evildoers are condemned to death by the secular authority, much more reason is there for heretics, as soon as they're convicted of heresy, to be not only excommunicated, but even put to death. In other words, they're saying theological disagreement is greater than all other evil doing, such as money forgers and whatever secular crimes there might be, which is dubious on its face, but that's what he wrote there. On the part of the church, however, there is mercy, which looks to the conversion of the wanderer. Therefore, she condemns not at once, but after the first and second admonition, as the apostle directs. After that, if they're still stubborn, looks to salvation of others by excommunicating him, that is to say, trying to protect the other people, which again, they're taking a valid principle and twisting it beyond recognition. And furthermore, delivers him to the secular tribunal. The Bible never says to do that for Christians, to be exterminated thereby from the world by death. Arius was but one spark in Alexandria, but as that spark was not at once put out, the whole earth was laid waste by his flame. Arius was, this is the debate between Arius and Athanasius that took place at the Council of Nicaea, had nothing to do with the canon, as most critics claim, without any justification or evidence. Constantine had absolutely nothing to do with Bible canon. He simply moderated the debate between those two guys, with Arius claiming that Jesus was a lesser created being, not on equality with God. And that was the debate. And Constantine simply wanted the bickering to stop. And so they had this official debate that would be the law after the verdict was reached. That's all Constantine cared about. It was only after he died that anybody in Rome decided to make an official canon list. And even then, it took some time. But the point being that that Arius was used in this example as some kind of heretic. And, theologically, I would agree that his teaching was not biblical, but the point is not actually the theology of people here, but the misapplication of Scripture to punish people who disagree theologically. Okay, the Bible, especially the New Testament, does not condone this. So the article goes on to say, we can say with little doubt that the Inquisitors of the Inquisition proceeded with firm belief in the rightness of their cause, as abhorrent as that cause may be in the eyes of late 20th century Christians. In other words, yeah, it was horrible and they should have known better, and you cannot use the excuse that even the reformers used for themselves, a product of his time, because even in the first century, when the Bible was completed, that these excuses would no longer work. The Bible, the New Testament, is filled with love your neighbor, treat others as better than yourselves, be compassionate, be gentle, and everything by example. In the New Testament, the way Christians behaved was not to go out and form armies. They didn't do that. They didn't try to overthrow governments. They simply took care of each other and stayed pure to the word, the teachings of the apostles, as it says in Acts 1 or 2 or something like that. And they didn't, they lived exemplary lives, and people noticed, and they spread the good news of Jesus rising from the dead. And that's how people could join their group. That's what the early church was. And so the anything else that isn't that is a corruption. And that includes all of church history, Protestant and Catholic alike. It's not what, I'm not saying they're all bad. There's a lot of good that comes out of it. And God will work around people in spite of their faults, and we all have them. There isn't any Christian group that's faultless. There isn't any individual that's faultless, even non-Christians who think they're faultless. It's not true. Everybody's got faults. But the point is that this Inquisition was all about enforcing one side against another, in sometimes the most cruel terms, and trying to use the Bible to justify it. I've gone over that before in the Equality series about slavery in the U.S. There were debates going on before the Civil War, and people were trying to use the Bible to justify slavery. And you can go to my blog and the feather.net site and look at an article called Sound Familiar, where I talk about the identical arguments between those that tried to justify slavery and those that try to justify male supremacy. They are identical arguments, and they both twist the scriptures in the same places pretty much. And so this is not something new, the twisting of scriptures to justify somebody's hatred. So this is what the Inquisition was all about, and they believed they were right in their cause. A lot of people have firm convictions and think themselves righteous when they're completely off the mark when you compare them to the Bible and to anything that Jesus and the apostles taught, especially. And the Bible even says, and I think it was a direct quote from Jesus, there will come a time when people who kill you will think they're doing God a service. And that time is quickly returning to the Western world. Even now in some countries, especially the Muslim-controlled areas, people think they're doing God a service by putting Christians to death in horrible ways and taking their property. It's just, that's one of the modern day instances or applications of the Inquisition. It still goes on. It's just not an official Catholic practice anymore, or an official Protestant practice anymore. But when you make things official, you make them an easier target, and Satan has learned that you do things under the table and in the dark so that you're not as easy to pick out and get rid of. And that's what goes on today. There are massive persecutions going on, especially against Christians, and real physical persecutions, and nobody knows about it, so nobody has a problem with it. They don't know it's there, or they don't care, or they just say, yeah, some people are being, hunted down in the Middle East, blah, 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 and they don't care. So anyway, back to the article. Historians often divide the study of the Inquisition into two major segments: the medieval or papal Inquisition, which was an arm of the papacy, and the Spanish Inquisition, which, while closely associated with the Church, the Catholic Church that is primarily viewed as a tool of the secular government of Spain. So for convenience, we're going to follow that convention. And then they go into a section on the medieval or papal Inquisition. By the 13th century, the dream of lasting Crusader kingdom in the Holy Lands was starting to fade. Pope Innocent III then turned the zeal of the Crusaders against fellow Christians. In 1202, the Fourth Crusade was launched, with later captured Constantinople. Next, in 1209, Innocent III launched a crusade against the Cathars, and you might know the Cathars from the other link in the description there, the video I did on little-known church history. Excuse me. Lasted for 20 years. Let's get down here. Against the Cathars in southern France, the Albigensian Crusade led to the establishment of the First Inquisition. So they were already doing Inquisitor stuff before they formally instituted it and called it that. The Albigensian Crusade, so named because of the name of the city, lasted for 20 years and authorized by the Pope, but the actual fighting was carried out primarily by secular forces, especially under this guy, the suppression of the Cathar heresy, so according to them. And, if you look closely at their teachings, it was deviating from the New Testament, but they didn't care whether it deviated from the New Testament. They cared whether it deviated from Catholic teachings, and later on it would be Protestant teachings, church teachings, we can just say, because one is not much better than the other. The point being that that's how heresy is defined in this context, is that it's against official teachings. So this went on for 20 years, and then the fighting was carried out by the secular forces. It's established new standards for ferocity for the Roman Church in dealing with its own flock. Perhaps the most famous example was in 1209, when the city of Béziers, or however, I'm butchering these names, I'm sure, with over 20,000 men, women, and children killed by Crusaders. The event will forever be framed in history by the words of papal legate, whoever the Arnud, I don't know, whom, when asked if Catholics should be spared during the assault, answered, "Kill them all, for God knows his own." And there's the quote there. Sounds like the Emperor from Star Wars, wipe them out, all of them. And, they don't make that stuff up in those movies. This is the sort of thing they get it from, and they're counting on most people not knowing it. Wholesale burnings of the Cathars were carried out during the Crusade, including 400 burnt after the fall of whatever in 1211, 94 burnt later. While the Albigensian Crusade had wiped out most of the Cathar strongholds, there were still heretics to be hunted down and burned, many of whom had gone into hiding. And they give some other examples. While the Cathars were the initial targets of the Inquisition and became synonymous with heretic because of the length of time and the severity of the attack, the scope of the Papal Inquisition would eventually range much wider and farther, I would say, but than the Cathars. Ultimately, it would include victims such as the Waldensians and other groups, and the Knights Templar, and then eventually Protestants. Not saying the Knights Templar were good people. I'm not saying any of these were necessarily Christian people according to the Bible, but the point is that they were being persecuted in ways that Christians should never do. And, like I said, both Protestant and Catholic, the Reformers did very similar things. They just didn't have as much power. By 1233, the Dominicans, the order founded by St. Dominic in 1217, were given the primary character to act as inquisitors, joined shortly after by the Franciscans, founded by St. Francis of Assisi in 1209-10. Curiously, the first 100 years of the Papal Inquisition could be said to have been a battle between ascetic groups. Many of the members of these groups were referred to as mendicant friars, meaning they received sustenance by begging. In other words, they were just left to their own devices. They weren't allowed to work, or apparently they had to sit and beg for money. By the 12th and 13th centuries, many members of the Roman Catholic clergy were known for their rather profligate living styles, including many monastics. In other words, they were living high on the hog. A number of, when you confiscate people's property, who do you give them to? You give them to your buddies, okay? A number of groups arose during this period that believed that the church should return to the example set by the apostles in Acts. The church should own no possessions. And that's not entirely true either. That's not what you read in Acts. It says many people gave willingly of their property to help each other, and that because they did that, there were no needy among them. In other words, everybody benefited. Those who had excess gave it to those who had lack, and there was equality. And Paul reiterated this teaching, in verbatim in his later letters, and said that this is the purpose of giving, not that some people have to give up everything and are destitute so that other people can be comforted, but that there may be equality. That's what the Bible says. And that's why the original church was such an awesome thing, because there were no needy among them. They took care of each other. And it was not communism, because communism is forced redistribution of wealth, where this was voluntary. And people didn't consider their possessions their own. That doesn't mean they didn't have any possessions. They just shared them willingly. That's all it meant. But of course, as is the habit of clergy everywhere in any denomination, Protestant or Catholic alike, things get twisted and used to the purposes of whoever is in control. So this isn't entirely accurate, but at least they thought that this is what the Bible taught, and so they gave up their possessions. And they believed the clergy should earn the respect of the people by giving up worldly goods, going out into the world to preach the gospel. There's nothing wrong with that part. And there's a whole book and a movie, The Name of the Rose, about that issue. Today, it can be initially difficult to understand why some ascetic groups, such as the Dominicans and Franciscans, were openly welcomed by the church and were the first inquisitors, while other ascetic groups, the Waldensians, the Cathars, the Fraticelli, were hunted down and burned at the stake. The answer, though, is rather clear. The former groups submitted to the authority of the church, while the latter groups ultimately rejected the authority of Pope and clergy. That's how you defined a heretic, if they defied the authority of the church and the Pope. And the clergy, the layers of command, the chains of command. So if you defied that hierarchy, you were a heretic. It didn't matter what the Bible said. It didn't matter whether whether you were an ascetic group like the others. That didn't matter. What mattered was obedience to secular or ecclesiastical authority. It should be noted, they go on here, that prior to the institution of the Papal Inquisition in 1227 to 31, local bishops had the authority to investigate and try heretics in local ecclesiastical courts. What made the Inquisition distinctive is that the inquisitors theoretically answered only to the Pope, not to the local bishop or even to the heads of the order. This autonomy allowed the Inquisition to act as an independent tribunal, able to go where it wanted, when it wanted, and try whom it wanted, with no interference allowed from local, secular, or ecclesiastical authorities. Like, I don't know, a world government. Those that tried to interfere with the autonomy of the Inquisition were, of course, branded as heretics themselves. So if the local authorities didn't like the feds, so to speak, coming in, swooping in, and overriding everything they did, they were then the heretics, and they were taken care of. So the highest authority was divested from all the other authorities except the Pope, and went out directly from the Pope as an Inquisition group, a tribunal that was not answerable to anybody but the Pope. And it didn't matter even if there were underlings working for the Pope. Those underlings, if they disagreed, too bad for them, they were heretics now. And I'm hoping as I'm reading this, you're seeing parallels that go on today in various groups of people, and not just political. It happens online as well. I'll get more to that later. So the runaway train of inquisitorial power, which lasted in various parts of the world for the next 600 years, had started its journey. It's not over. I can tell you that. It's much longer than 600 years. But officially, okay, targets of the medieval Inquisition, the Cathars. The initial target was a group of people known as Cathars, which come from the Greek word kathaori, meaning pure. That's why we call something a catharsis. Okay, that's what it means, to purify. They were mostly in southern France, and somewhat unique among the targets is the fact that the Cathars were really heretics in the sense of having an opinion or doctrine not in line with the accepted teaching of the church. They were 13th century Gnostics, okay? So again, I'm not defending these groups or their theology, but I am saying the larger church, so-called, had no right to persecute them. You can simply disfellowship people. That's what they did in the New Testament. That's what Paul wrote to do, that if somebody was not following the teachings of Jesus and the apostles, that you just put them out of your fellowship, and that's all. That's all you did. And Paul even said in 1 Corinthians 5, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? Expel the wicked one from among you. So that's all they did, was say, you can't you can't be a part of our group. That's all they did. Okay. And that's how you kept the church pure then. You just didn't acknowledge those people as part of your fellowship. Okay. What these people did was way beyond that. All right. So although these people would have, in the time of Paul, would have been simply disfellowshipped, the Catholic Church and later the Protestant Church would not be content with that. Okay. The Inquisitors certainly were not content with that. So these Cathars were Gnostics. It says a 2nd century quasi-Christian group. The Cathars and Gnostics were dualists. They believed that there were two creator gods, a pure God that created the heavens and things spiritual, and an evil God that created all things physical and temporal. They generally associated the evil God with the God of the Old Testament. People are still teaching that today. They're still teaching in the conspiracy realm that Yahweh is the evil demiurge of the Old Testament. They did not make up that teaching. It's an old teaching, and yet these same people will denounce any defense any of us make about the Bible because it's old. So they can't have their cake and eat it too, although they try. But we need to know our own Bible better than they do, and we need to know history better than they do, and say, look, you can't use one part of old documents to denounce another part of old documents and then say old documents are all a lie. Okay? You can't use two opposing things like that, but they do. And so this is what was going on back then in the Middle Ages. Okay, and it's still, like I said, it hasn't ended. This sort of hypocrisy, this double standard, is being used today. Anyway, this is what these pseudo, I wouldn't even call it quasi-Christian. I would, only in the fact that people put a Christian veneer on things is as far as I would take it. But certainly this is not a Christian idea. Jesus never denounced the Old Testament, neither did any of the New Testament writers. These people were also Docetists, I think that's how you pronounce it. They believe that Jesus was spirit, not flesh and blood. That's a Gnostic idea, okay? They don't believe Jesus came in the flesh, and you can read in the Gospel of John that anyone who does not agree that Jesus came in the flesh is under condemnation. So this is, very bad theology on the part of the Cathars, but it doesn't excuse their treatment by the papal authority and by the Inquisition. That's my point. Okay, so they rejected the doctrine of the death of Jesus on the cross and the subsequent resurrection. So that's just to say they weren't Christians at all. That's the crux, if you will. Crux, it means, it comes from the word for crucify. That is the absolute, it's a cross point, really. And it's the point of an argument. It's also, as I've gone on before about chiastic arguments, that the Greek letter chi, C-H-I, is an X. Okay, and that cross point, it's the letter X is a good illustration of how you have a general argument. You work your way down to your main point, and then you go back in reverse order if you're looking from top to bottom on an X. So anyway, that's where we get crux of something. And the crux of Christianity is that Jesus came in the flesh, lived a sinless life, died, and rose again. If you don't believe that, you cannot call yourself a Christian according to the Bible. So these people rejected that, but again, they did not deserve to be hunted down and persecuted and destroyed for it. Okay, so regardless, it also, just by a way, it goes on to say they seem to have believed in reincarnation, so they weren't Christians. But they had this, they talk about a little bit of their sacraments and things. They were rumored to be keepers of some great secret, but that was just a rumor. And they were extinct by the beginning of the 14th century, it says here, except, little pockets of survival other places. Victims of a merciless crusade and a relentless inquisition. So they were pretty much wiped out. It took a while, but did they deserve to be wiped out? No. Did they deserve to be called Christians? No. But the power authorities, the church in that case had no right to do what they did. And there are other groups, the Waldensians, began living life of mendicant and mendicant. His theological basis appears to have been Mark 10:22, sell everything you have and give to the poor, and then come and follow me. Again, Jesus was saying this to one person in one situation because that person was rich, and those riches were getting in the way of his salvation. And that's the point Jesus was making, and not saying every Christian should sell everything they have. And, then how would the church take care of each other if nobody had anything? So anyway, another twist. And then they go on about the history of this Waldo guy the Waldensians were named after. They were refused permission to preach by the Archbishop of Lyons, and then Pope Lucius III excommunicated the poor men of Lyons. Anyway, they rejected many tenets of Roman Catholicism, including the priesthood, indulgences, purgatory, transubstantiation, and praying to the saints. This sounds a lot like the Reformation. Many of them became followers of reformer John Huss, who was burned at the stake. The Hussians, so-called. In 1532, the Waldensians decided to integrate into the Protestant faith. They mentioned this William Farel, and not just be confused with an actor by the similar name, an associate of John Calvin, was instrumental in that integration. So here again, even though the reformers did reform a lot, they didn't break away completely, and they took a lot of the bad elements that had rushed into the Catholic Church. They took them and just changed the names a little bit, and to the point where they don't go into this article, but Calvin was eventually called the Pope of Geneva. He was a very ruthless ruler, and not, by his behavior, not a Christian at all. So I don't have anything nice to say about a lot of the reformers either. Then it says, few groups have suffered persecution as long as terrible as the Waldensians, who were hunted down and slaughtered by both the Inquisition and secular forces for hundreds of years. The most infamous incident of persecution against the Waldensians was the Piedmont Easter, when French forces massacred 1,712 Waldensian men, women, and children. Unlike most medieval groups that were targets of the Inquisition, the Waldensians still exist today, 800 years after they were excommunicated. So bad things have happened. They're still happening to Christians all over the place. But these, even if the Khazars weren't Christians, it's still the persecutors are persecuting for whatever reason. The reason doesn't matter. The label doesn't matter. It's that the people are doing evil and making excuses for it, whether it's the Bible or secular government, communism, whatever you want to call it, Islam. Anytime people use something as a reason to do something else, you can't blame the thing that they've decided to use as the scapegoat or excuse. You blame the people who do the evil, okay? Evil is done by evil people. It's not the Jews, the Christians, whatever. Evil is done by evil people, and that's as pure and simple as that. And now the Knights Templar. The article says, perhaps the most famous victims of the Papal Inquisition. Again, I'm not saying the Templars were good people, okay? Not saying that. But they were targets of the Inquisition. It's like spy versus spy from the Old Man magazine. These were internal factions. The most famous victims were the Templars, example of how the Inquisition could be manipulated for personal and political gain. They were founded, the Templars, in 1119 AD, 1119, to protect pilgrim routes to the Holy Lands. Over time, these warrior monks became key figures in the Crusades. One source estimates that over 20,000 Knights Templar were killed in the Crusades. The Templars were notable for the fact that they answered only to the Pope and not to any local ecclesiastical authority. So in other words, they were just like the Inquisitors, but they were also targets of the Inquisitors. In time, the Templars established local offices called temples throughout Western Christendom. Also, always innovative, they started what is considered by many to be the first European banking system, and it was by their involvement as bankers that eventually led to their downfall. By early 1300s, King Philip IV of France was deeply in debt to the Paris Temple. In 1307, he charged the order with heresy. Convenient. Charges eventually brought against the Templars included that postulants were required to deny Christ and spit on the cross, and that the Templars worshipped a mysterious head named Baphomet, perhaps a mangling of Mohammed. This article is guessing. These charges were never proved except in confessions received under torture at the hands of the Inquisition. In other words, a lot of what people believe about the Templars might not even be true. Even though, yes, there's plenty of evidence against them, and the banking issue is certainly a strike against them. But other things they may or may not have done, you got to be careful who you listen to, okay? So there were rumors spread. Anyway, and I don't like falsehood, even if it's against reprehensible people. You got to tell the truth about people. And sometimes that means circumstantial evidence, but at least you have to have some evidence. You know, you can't just do hearsay, even though there are people who say don't do hearsay who do hearsay. Go figure. Anyway, the Inquisition of France brought forth the formal charges against the Templars. This was necessary because, previously noted, the Templars were immune from local ecclesiastical jurisdiction, so they had to go above their heads. The Council of Vienna in 1312 officially dissolved the order, giving most of their property, bankers that they were, to a similar order named the Hospitallers or something. The final part of the saga of the Knights Templar occurred in 1314 when the Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay was burned alive after recanting of his earlier confession. So he was one of those so-called heretics who, probably, well, I don't care, but according to the church's definition of a heretic, who repented and then went back to it. And so he was burned alive at the stake. And you will find that this de Molay name today in usually colleges and things, organizations like that, the Order of de Molay. So he was a Templar, a Grand Master. After they were dissolved, the French crown received cancellation of all debts owed to the Templars. Yay, they got rid of their debts by killing the opposition that they owed it to, as well as much of their monetary wealth. Then we have a little bit on Joan of Arc here, that you can read that. That's not a big deal as far as points I want to make today. There was one instance in this where this one pope was a rare example of the Inquisition being overridden by the pope, that they went a little too far even for the pope in that case, and they canonized Joan of Arc eventually in 1920. But she lived in 1429, and they're a little slow, you might say, but anyway, this is, not really a central point in anything. There's this John Huss that they mentioned a little bit ago, so you can read about this person. He questioned purgatory, the doctrine of transubstantiation, that is that the wine and the bread become the literal body and blood of Christ, and he rejected confession. Those are good points, if you ask me, good things to reject. Huss defined the church as a total of the saved in heaven and on earth, so similar to Calvin, and believed that Christ, not the Pope, was the head of the church. That's biblical. Like Luther would follow him, he believed the Bible was the ultimate spiritual authority. But of course, Luther had his faults too. They were serious faults, and so did Calvin. Anyway, these things by themselves are biblical things. He was eventually tried for heresy by the Council of Constance, acting as a court of inquisition. He was burned at the stake in 1415 in the city of Constance. The Moravian church, which he founded, survived and exists to this day. Then there's other groups. The Inquisitors themselves, it was the mendicant orders, especially the Dominicans and the Franciscans, that administered the courts of the Inquisition. This is a matter of some debate to this day as to whether there's respective founders of those orders, Dominic and Francis of Assisi, should be accorded any responsibility. That is to say, the followers did more of this sort of thing than the founders. And then they say a little bit about the Dominicans, about St. Dominic himself, born in 1170, became an Augustinian canon, adopted a life of poverty. The way he believed to bring back heretics into the Roman Church was by zealous preaching, humility, austerity, and holiness. Those are not bad qualities to have, at least as a principle. By one of those strange twists of historic fate, Dominic ended up preaching in this, I can't even pronounce that, area of France 4 years before the beginning of the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in the same region. In 1217, this other pope, impressed by the efforts of Dominic, licensed the creation of the Order of Preachers, also known as the Black Friars, and the Dogs of the Lord. Later, they would be known primarily as Dominicans. At the time of Dominic's death in 1221, there were 60 Dominican monasteries, and then that went to 300. They were given the task of running the courts of the Inquisition, a task that they took to with great ferocity and effectiveness for the next several hundred years. So they're saying, debating whether St. Dominic should be considered the first inquisitor. Maybe even a song in the 1960s might have been about him. But Dominic had been dead more than a decade before the Pope appointed the Dominicans as inquisitors. So there's that. Anyway, this is just some interesting things about, because the names Franciscans and Dominicans are kind of familiar, so I spent more time on them. The other group was the Franciscans, and of course they're around today. Francis himself was the son of a wealthy merchant. He gave up his wealth, embraced a life of poverty and service to the poor, founded the Franciscan order in 1209 and 1210. Sounds eerily similar to that of Peter Waldo. So why was one canonized, Francis, in 1228, and the other excommunicated, Waldo, in 1184? Francis, while embracing the life of a mendicant friar, always accepted the authority of the church. Francis died in 1226, several years before Gregory IX pressed his order into service as inquisitors. So there again, you have what really matters as a sin or not in the eyes of the Roman Church was whether you obeyed their authority. Their authority, not necessarily the Bible or anything else. Okay, that was the dividing line. So people who were doing pretty much the same things, one was elevated and the other destroyed on the basis of whether they bowed to the Pope. Okay, and later this would be, like I said, Calvin, the great reformer, so-called, was called the Pope of Geneva. He was just as ruthless. So I'm not picking on the Catholics when it comes to behavior. Other famous inquisitors, and you can read through that list. By the end of the 15th century, the original papal inquisition which was, remember, as you recall, created to eradicate the Cathars, had pretty much run its course. There was no one left to burn. However, the flames of the Inquisition would receive new life in the mid-16th century as the Papal Inquisition was reconstituted to fight a new perceived enemy of the Roman Church, the Protestants. By the 1540s, the Roman Catholic Church, and we are lumped with them all the time. Everybody, our greatest critics in the conspiracy realm seem to be people who think all Christians are Catholics. By 1540s, the Roman Catholic Church was reeling from the effects of Protestantism all through Europe. While once the Pope reigned supreme over all Western Christendom, by 1540, the whole countries had been lost to Protestant usurpers, including England, Germany, and Switzerland. France, too, was starting to look shaky. And unthinkably, Protestantism was even making inroads into Italy itself. This was intolerable, of course. The Roman Church viewed that something must be done to stem the tide of defections. This set of methodologies employed to do so is collectively known as the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation used several methods to attempt to save the church, not to save Christianity, but to save the church. One was to call a great church council, the Council of Trent, met from 1545 to 1563, and enacted many church reforms and restated basic Catholic beliefs. Other methods included the creation of a new militant religious order, the Jesuits, and open warfare against Protestant strongholds, the 30 Years' War in Germany. And one more tool was used with ruthless efficiency, the Inquisition. Okay, and this, remember, 1540s was when the Jesuits were created. So no one can say that the Jesuits wrote the Bible. It was long, well established, and we have documents to prove it. More than 1,000 years before the Jesuits even existed. But anyway, I've gone over that too many times already. I won't do that again. Pope Paul III reconstituted the Papal Inquisition as a congregation of the Inquisition, or the Holy Office. The Pope appointed a commission to administer the Inquisition and made Cardinal, whatever his name was, the Inquisitor, the Grand Inquisitor. He made his intentions clear. No man must debase himself by showing toleration toward heretics of any kind, above all toward Calvinists. Okay, 1555, the Grand Inquisitor became Pope Paul IV. He increased the power of the Inquisition both in Italy and Spain. He published the first index of forbidden books. Eventually, the works of all the major reformers would appear on the list. Okay, Calvin, Zwingli, Luther. Paul IV was also known for charming sentiments such as the following: even if my own father was a heretic, I would gather the wood to burn him. That's the kind of people they were. These were not Christians by definition of the Bible, not by what people would claim is the no true Scotsman fallacy. You can look that up, no true Scotsman fallacy, basically saying that if anybody is in a group of people and do bad things, that the excuse would be, well, they're just not one of us. Whereas with the Bible, we have the Bible to go by. We use that as our measure, and we measure true and false Christians by what it teaches about what Christians are supposed to believe and do. And by that account, these people were not Christians. Okay, that kind of a sentiment is an anti-Christian sentiment. Yet they're doing these things in the name of church to smear it. Okay, and after the death of Paul IV in 1559, Europe received a respite from the Inquisition for several years. But in 1566, another Grand Inquisitor became Pope Pius V, the second time in a little over a decade that a Grand Inquisitor became Pope. So the Jesuits in the papal office is nothing new, basically. And whether you want to call them Jesuits or not, they're of the same ilk, and they're of the same anti-Christian, wolf in sheep's clothing kind of ilk. Under Pius V, torture again became a common weapon in the Papal Inquisition. In 1566, he organized the first of what were to be many public acts of faith, bad name for such a thing, in Rome itself. Beheadings and burnings became common occurrences. So it isn't just the Muslims who behead heretics. And then, believing what I do about the rise of Babylon in the end times, again, I have always said that beheadings doesn't necessarily indicate Islam. Okay, it's not something Islam invented. The reconstituted Papal Inquisition was especially successful in Italy. Almost all vestiges of incipient Protestantism were wiped out by the end of the 16th century. The most famous victim would come in the 7th century. Galileo Galilei was brought up on charges before the Court of Inquisition. Knowing the history of the Inquisition, you have a little bit different twist on this trial. Okay, and this happened in 1633 for publishing The Great Systems of the Universe, which backed the Copernican and Kepler views of the movements of the planets, that the Earth revolved around the sun, and I won't get into all of that. Unfortunately, Galileo had been warned in 1616 to stay out of the debate regarding the Earth orbiting the sun. Thus, when brought before the Inquisition, he was determined to be a recidivist, I can't even say it, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence was later softened by the Pope to be house arrest. Like Joan of Arc before him, the inquisitional charge and sentence against Galileo was eventually overturned when it was too late to help. Isn't that convenient? There are a lot of people who do that on a personal basis, where they apologize after it's too late to actually do something. Anyway, that didn't happen until 1992. I can't. This must have some JavaScript running that I can't even select text. So he was over. This condemnation was overturned in 1992 by Pope John Paul II. So when did the Papal Inquisition officially end? It was officially supplanted by the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith during Vatican II in 1962 to 65. That's the official end of the Inquisition. There they give you a timeline, so you can go over that if you want, and ending with that pardon by Pope John Paul II. Then we have the, excuse me, the Spanish Inquisition. As horrible as the papal one was, in modern times, the Spanish Inquisition became almost synonymous with the excesses, violence, and cruelty of the Inquisition. We know King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, that's where they come in, having to do with Christopher Columbus to appoint an inquisitional board in 1480. The express purpose of the Inquisition was to root out false Christians in Spain, especially Jews and Muslims, what they call them then, who claimed to convert to Christianity but were still secretly practicing their faith. It remained for 354 years, until 1834, when the Queen Mother Christina announced and declared that the Tribunal of the Inquisition is definitely suppressed. So the last recorded death attributed to the Inquisition was in 1826, when a poor schoolmaster was garroted to death for allegedly teaching deist principles. Here again, none of this is Christian, because all you have to do is look at the New Testament for the definition of what Christians believe and do, and you can see that these are not Christians. I don't care what they call themselves, they're not Christians by definition of the Bible. The first Grand Inquisitor, they go into the Spanish Inquisitions, they talk about victims, Jews and Muslims, and now, of course, it's the Muslims persecuting the Christians. Some people say turnabout is fair play, but again, the evil is in doing these things, and you don't make yourself better by returning the favor. Okay, you simply lower yourself to their level, and you have, by taking your own vengeance, you are negating the vengeance that you could have gotten from God. And the Bible says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. This is why you don't take your own vengeance. Okay, and one of the reasons is that A, you can't do a thorough job of it and do it justly, and B, that this is something that only makes more violence and brings you down to the level of the people that persecuted you. So if you're paying back, be careful, because God can do a much better job if there is truly an injustice. And then if you act like the others, then you are no better than the others. And this is a lesson for everybody, you know, that we all slip up at times on that sort of thing. But these were the victims of the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, and then they turned on the Protestants. Okay, they were frequent targets of the Spanish Inquisition. Among the victims were native Protestants, Lutherans, and Calvinists, such as Francisco de San Roman, who was the first Protestant burned at the stake in Spain in 1540. More controversial were Protestants that stirred on merchant vessels visiting Spanish ports. 26 English subjects were burned at the stake. 10 times that number were sentenced to inquisitorial prisons. Okay, so Protestants were being persecuted as well. It wasn't just Jews and Muslims. Needless to say, the situation became a major bone of contention between Spain and its trading partners. In 1604, the Treaty of London was signed, which forbade subjects of the King of England from being persecuted. So this began as a religious thing, and you know, here again, they didn't like to separate such things, and with the secular. So a caveat existed in the treaty: English subjects in Spain were only safe provided they did not cause a public scandal. So even then, they gave themselves loopholes. Like the Papal Inquisition in Italy in the 16th century, the Spanish Inquisition was very successful at preventing Protestantism from gaining a foothold in Spain, and that is why most of the Spanish-speaking peoples tend to be Roman Catholics. And you have a timeline of that. Methodologies. The prisoners were not confronted with the accuser or the informer. Nor is there any informer or witness who is not listened to. A public convict, a notorious malefactor, an infamous person, a common prostitute, a child are in the Holy Office, though nowhere else, credible accusers and witnesses. Even the son may depose his father, the wife against her husband, as Voltaire wrote this in the History of the Christian Church. So in other words, they did not do due process, to say the least. Okay? This is, as I just read here in the quote, the prisoners don't get to see who accused them. This is often true online. We're not allowed to know the name or the face or the identity of those who accuse us of things, and that the witnesses, even though sometimes they are telling the truth, it turns out, the witnesses are a low character themselves. The credibility of a witness is an extremely important part of justice, whether you want to hate the legal system or not, and there's many reasons to do so. Due legal process is a good thing when it happens. It rarely happens, but even among people on the internet, there is no due legal process. They show by their actions that they're no better than the powers that be and the governments as they are, because they also condemn people in mob violence and incredible, not incredible, but non-credible witnesses who make charges, and you never see who your inquisitor is. You're never given a fair trial. You're just condemned by the mob. That goes on today. That's why I'm saying inquisitions then and now is still going on by people who think they're awake, who think they have escaped the powers that be, who think they oppose them, who are doing the same things. They are opposing, especially Christians now. War has apparently been declared in the flat earth community against Christians, that we're a threat. They're afraid of us, because that's what when you consider someone a threat, you're afraid of them. And so you lash out and condemn and push them away. And I, for one, am glad that they're doing that, because I would not want to be associated with the Inquisitors, the people who condemn you just because you're a Christian who has convictions about your faith and follows the Bible. Then you're the enemy. Then guess who the enemy that is accusing you is. So the enemy of Christ is an antichrist. And this is going on in the conspiracy realm. And they are inquisitors getting rid of the heretics, the Christians. Okay. And they will say, no, it's the other way around. And we're like, well, you know, pots and kettles. Who is the Grand Inquisitor? Where is the tribunal, the brown shirts who are going to go around and persecute Christians and get rid of them out of the so-called flat earth community? There is no community. There is only this hateful mob that goes around, making baseless accusations against us and ignoring their own faults, just as these literal inquisitors of the past in both the medieval, the papal, and the Spanish Inquisitions. They're doing the same things as the Jesuits they claim to be against. They were, not just to use Jesuits as a term that's thrown around by them. They are inquisitors today in the internet, on YouTube, trying to call Christians heretics and a threat to their precious, conspiracy theories, and especially in the flat earth community, so-called, the Inquisitors are getting rid of the Christian heretics. That's what's going on. And that's one of the main reasons I wanted to do this. Let's find out what an Inquisition is, and let's compare what people are doing today with what they did in the past. Because it's easy to condemn the papal and Spanish Inquisitions, but people who are condemning them are doing the same things. That's my point. To the late 20s, going back to the article, late 20th century Americans, excuse me, the methodologies of the Inquisition are understandably horrifying. The Inquisition created an atmosphere where the denouncing of real or imagined sins of neighbors, business partners, and even family members was encouraged. The accused had almost no rights, no right to a lawyer, no right to know who their accusers were, no right to know the nature of the charges leveled against them. Torture was used in many cases to extract confessions. The methodologies and the ferocity of the Inquisition stood as unique in the history of Western civilization until the Nazis and communists of the 20th century. So, they're famous for their own, and it goes on today. People are being tortured today. But in the virtual world of the internet, people are having their property confiscated. I'm going to shut your channel down. Ever hear that? I've heard that many times. The Christian channels are hearing that even in days past, probably going on today. I'm going to shut your channel down. That is to say, I'm going to take your property. And who takes your property? An inquisitor, a Jesuit. That's the kind of people who go around threatening to take other people's property and to get rid of them out of society, a virtual death, you might say, and to torture them first by spreading rumors about them. Those are the Inquisitors. That's our modern day Inquisitors in the, at least in YouTube and the message boards. So typically the cycle of Inquisition would start with the Inquisitor and his entourage visiting a particular town or parish. The Inquisitor would often preach to the population in the town, square, or church about the sin of heresy, according to them. An edict of faith was often published by the Inquisitor, giving detailed instructions as to how to spot a heretic, either in other people or in yourself. Typically, a 1 to 4 week term of grace followed in which voluntary confessions were sought. Those that stepped forward voluntarily and admitted to their heresy were often given limited punishment. Also, during this period, the Inquisitor would start accumulating information from denouncers, those that were reporting heresy in others. This was, of course, a convenient way to do away with a business or personal rival. Although there was one safeguard, which will be described later, they said here in the article, sometimes the Inquisitor would call upon a whole parish or city to testify. Sometimes 8,000 to 10,000 people. After the period of grace, everyone in the parish or city that had not voluntarily confessed was at risk of being denounced. The Inquisition only required evidence of two witnesses for prosecution. And as pointed out by Voltaire in the preamble of this section, the Inquisitors were not very choosy about who could bring the denunciation. Wives and husbands could testify against each other. Convicted heretics and convicted criminals could denounce others. So, and that's what goes on in the internet. It goes on in YouTube. All you have to do is start a rumor, do a hit piece, and a lot of people will follow you in condemning the person without knowing anything about the truth or caring about the truth or having a way to find the truth. They don't care. The experiences of the accused. Once a person had been accused, he or she was politely summoned to appear before the Inquisition. Such an appearance was not a requirement, but a failure to appear was taken as evidence of guilt. That is to say, if you don't do a return hit piece or you don't say anything, you are presumed guilty. During the Inquisition, several inquisitors wrote handbooks for budding inquisitors. The excerpt, so this is like the handbook of the shills that was going around the internet message boards some years ago. This is an excerpt. The inquisitor should behave in a friendly manner and act as though he already knows the whole story. In other words, it's a bluff. He should glance at his papers and say, "It is quite clear you're not telling the truth," or should pick up a document and look surprised, saying, "How can you lie to me like this when what I've got written down here contradicts everything you told me?" He should then continue, just confess. You can see that I know the whole story already. So this is mind control. This is, gaslighting people. This is bluffing. And it goes on today, every day in the message boards and the online conspiracy communities and YouTube and Facebook and places like that. This is what goes on. They have talking points. They have strategies where they say they, manipulate the crowd to presume somebody guilty that they don't like. And they get they torture the people, mentally and emotionally, and then get their channel shut down and ruin them and go on to the next victim of whoever they don't happen to like. It goes on here. Inquisition trials were held in secret. Suspects were not told the names of their accusers. However, they could be asked for a list of people that might bear them ill will. If the names of the denouncers were on the list, the accused was often set free. Clever suspects would often present very long lists. In other words, if you list everybody in town, you're bound to get off the hook. So the accused were not able to call witnesses in their own defense, nor were they allowed to have counsel present. In some areas, lawyers for the accused were allowed, but if the accused were found guilty of heresy, the lawyer could also be so charged for having defended them. So who wanted to be one of those defenders? The accused were often put into inquisitorial prisons during the time between arrest and sentence. In Spain, this period would often last for 3 to 4 years. During imprisonment, the accused usually had to pay their own expenses. This fact and the fact that suspects found guilty of heresy often had to forfeit their property meant that the Inquisition was often targeted against the wealthy rather than the poor. During the period of imprisonment, the accused was not allowed to talk to anyone other than the Inquisitors. Since the primary stated goal of the Inquisition was to save souls, suspects were continually encouraged to confess to their heresy. Those that admitted their guilt were willing to give the Inquisition names of other potential heretics and were often let off with penances. So there you go. Harshest sentences, such as all your property or burning at the stake, were reserved for 2 types of offenders: those who refused to recant of their heresy and relapsed heretics. I've gone over that before a little bit. And they were handed over to the secular authorities for punishment. And the church had a motto: the church shrinks from blood. That is to say, they didn't want to do their own dirty work. There's a lot of people like that today who direct shills and trolls and the lowlifes who go around making baseless and vulgar accusations against other people. Based on this motto, the church itself would not administer the death sentence. Rather, this was left to the local secular authorities. The chosen method for administering capital punishment, burning at the stake, was partially chosen because it did not shed blood. In other words, they didn't cut you, so they weren't technically shedding blood. This is how pharisaical the people were and how they are today. The families of the heretics that were burned typically had their property confiscated. In Spain, descendants of heretics could not serve in public office, and a bunch of other things. Use of torture, was used in about 1/3 of cases to extract confessions. And since some people questioned whether confessions received under torture were valid, the accused would be asked to verify what they admitted under torture several hours later. If they refused to validate their confession, they would be subject to more torture. So what do you think they're going to do? Popular methods of torture included flogging, burning, the rack, roasting of feet over burning coals. The victim's hands would be tied behind their back and they'd be lifted off the ground. I'm not going to go into all that, water torture. Oh, waterboarding. Gee, they did that then. Where did they learn that for today? So this is exactly what they're describing here, waterboarding. And the victim would risk suffocation and they did not confess. So this goes on today, and there's virtual torture being done against innocent people on the internet by the same kind of mentality that would certainly do these things literally if they had the ability, the power. And that power will return soon, but it will be short-lived, but not short enough for the people who are victims of these kinds of people who are on the internet today. So I think I'm going to skip to the end here as to their results and commentary. As pointed out in other parts of the book, the Inquisition was extremely effective in achieving its specific goals. Catholicism was almost totally destroyed by the 14th century. Non-Christians were driven out of Spain by that is to say non-Catholics really. Protestantism was never able to gain a foothold in Italy or Spain. From a broader point of view, the Inquisition was less successful. The resentments caused by the Inquisition helped spur the growth of Protestantism in areas not under strict Roman Church dominance. How should we judge the Inquisition morally? Apologists will quickly point out that the Inquisition was not the only societal structure that burned heretics during the Middle Ages, and that's true. But secular rulers, and because they go on to say that the secular rulers in these areas also burned heretics on their own without any inquisitional help. Protestant sovereigns in England ordered capital punishment for Catholics, so they returned the favor, like I was just saying earlier. And in Calvin's Geneva, that great bastion of Protestantism, Catholicism, adultery, blasphemy, idolatry, and witchcraft were all punishable by death, and 58 people were executed during Calvin's reign on such charges. The most notable being a guy named Michael Servetus, the discoverer of the circulatory system, who foolishly went to Geneva, and Calvin had vowed that if Servetus ever came there, that he would have him killed. And he did. He kept him in a very harsh prison for a while, and then they had basically a kangaroo court and had him condemned, and they strapped his heretical writings, according to Calvin, to his chest and burned him at the stake, but they used green wood so the suffering would take a lot longer. And I think it took, a long time for him to die, and he's screaming the whole time, and people stood around and just watched. That's what Calvin oversaw, and Calvin never expressed any remorse for this. He whined instead that he was being, quote unquote, persecuted for what he did by people who said what he did was horrible. And Calvinists today will defend him as being the victim of persecution because people opposed him for this death of Servetus. So that's how twisted things get. So I don't put the Calvinists on any higher pedestal than I would put the Roman Catholic popes or the church and their teachings. I disagree with a lot of people, and that doesn't mean I hate the people who are in those institutions today. It's an individual thing. Like I said, evil is done by evil people, but I think it's incumbent upon anybody who is part of an organization to know what the top brass believe and what they're promoting and supporting. I think that's important for every, especially Christian, to do. Know who is, whose namesake you're carrying around and representing. And that includes Jesus especially. You have to know who you're representing and act accordingly. So that's what people are saying about this. But as an institution, the Inquisition stands alone in terms of length of time. And like I said, I don't think it's over. I think it was more than 600 years. The number of its victims, the ruthlessness of its methodologies, and the intolerance that it fostered. Such intolerance goes on today, and the methods, although virtual for the most part in the Western world, is no better. There are people running around the internet today who will stop at nothing and can't stoop low enough to destroy people who weren't even bothering them, who simply disagree on some issue. And this is seen as heresy in their eyes, and so they feel justified in persecuting anyone who doesn't toe their line. Okay, so that's going on today. I'm going to take a quick look at the chat here, and then I have to get going and do some things. Hello to everybody who came. Glad you could be here. I'm hoping this wasn't too boring. I do go through these things as quickly as I can. But you can see the mentality. The point I'm making is the Inquisition goes on. It's the mentality and attitude and actions of people that make them inquisitors, that make them evil people. You can't blame a group by their lineage, even by their religion for the most part. You have to blame them by what they themselves as individuals do and believe and act on their beliefs. And that's who you can tell is an inquisitor. If they're doing the hit pieces, they're sniping, they're spreading rumors, condemning you without evidence, or bringing witnesses that themselves are lowlifes. Those are your powers that be. Those are your inquisitors. And this is definitely a spiritual war, a virtual war, but it will become a hot war, a physical war soon. We all have to be prepared for that. So I'm just saying that goes along with what Jesus said. It's not what goes into you that defiles you, it's what comes out of you. And we're seeing these things coming out of people, and that this is what's in your head and your heart is what is going to condemn you or acquit you at the judgment. And so there are people who go around saying bad Jesuits bad inquisitors, bad powers that be, who are like them in every way except having the power to literally enforce their will. So other than that, I don't see a whole lot in the chat. I just looked real quickly. I haven't been a lot of people. There's only 4 people here now, and that's fine. That's, I did start a little bit later. But I don't know. I can't figure out what works best for people. There have been some that have said, I missed it because you started too early. But anyway, I think the message I'm trying to get across is that if you study the Inquisition as a whole, you will see that it hasn't ended at all. There's, as far as historically concerned and where people like to draw lines around certain events and epochs in history, but the mentality goes on, and that's what we have to guard against. So thanks for the few of you who came, and we'll catch you all later.